So yeah, let's talk about the history of Sega, Mega Drive, and Genesis, and Sega Music. On to the presentation. So yeah, the Sega Mega Drive, Sega Genesis is a 16-bit fourth generation home video console developed and sold by Sega. It was Sega's third console and the successor to the Master System. They released it in 1988 in Japan as the Mega Drive, and then in 1989 in North America as the Genesis. It came out in Europe pretty soon. It was also called the Master Drive, or Mega Drive rather, in Europe as well. But it came out in 1989, the year I was born, in North America, and we're mostly going to be talking about the North American release of Sega. In Japan, the Mega Drive fared poorly against its two main competitors, Nintendo's Super Famicom, also known as a Super Nintendo, or Super NES in the United States, and NEC's PC engine, but it achieved considerable success in North America, especially North America, but also in Brazil and Europe. Contributing to its success was its library of arcade game ports, the popularity of Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog series, several popular sports franchises, and aggressive youth marketing, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today, is Sega's North American marketing. That's what positioned it as the cool console for adolescents. The 1991 North American release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System triggered a fierce battle for market share in the United States and Europe, known as the Console Wars. You probably heard this term before. They continued up until kind of recently. They're kind of still going, but they just shifted which companies were warring eventually. There's a really good documentary about all this stuff on, I think it's on Paramount Plus, called Console Wars. It's super good. It's great, actually. It's totally worth the watch. And then there's a Netflix series called High Score. It doesn't just cover Sega and Super Nintendo. It covers the history of all video games, and that's also super, super good. Highly recommend that one as well. Anyway, yeah. So the Console Wars. So, as I mentioned, Sega did not do well in Japan. It was released as the Mega Drive on October 29th, 1988, a little Halloween release in Japan. The launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's release of Super Mario Bros. 3 a week earlier. Even though it was a previous generation system, the game was so popular that it kind of stopped Sega from getting traction in Japan for a long time. It eventually started selling a little, but it never made the success that it had, like in North America. So Sega announced the North American release date for the system as January 9th, 1989. At the time, Sega did not possess a North American sales and marketing organization and was distributing its Master System through a different company, but you'll never guess which one.
Let her go.
We took two of the world's toughest trucks and a 400-foot cliff. And this is the truck made by Tonka.
That's right. They distributed the Sega Genesis originally through Tonka of North America, which is hilarious. That was the first company that sold and distributed the Sega Genesis system in North America. It did not do well, though. Tonka did a bad job marketing and selling the system. Sega, the company, was generally unhappy. I know, it's so crazy. I was watching other old Tonka ads. There was a lot of other ones I wanted to post. There's a 70s one where it's like kids like just playing really hard with their toys and trying to tear them up. Tonka's whole thing, which is kind of awesome actually, their whole marketing campaign was, we make toys that don't break. Like your kids can beat the hell out of all of our toys. They can play as hard as they want and they will not break them, which I think is awesome. I mean, toys are generally junk. They were back then, they still are. But Tonka stuff is well made. The trucks used to be all metal and stuff. Anyway, so Tonka distributed Sega in North America for a while. Oops, let me skip to the next slide here. Dissatisfied with Tonka's performance, Sega looked for a new partner to market the Genesis in North America and offered the rights to the Atari Corporation, who had been a successful video game hardware sales company in America already. They are an American company. and they did not yet have a 16-bit system. However, they declined. Atari, after some deliberation, was not interested in picking up the Sega Genesis. So Sega decided to launch the console through its own company. They started a Sega of America subsidiary, like their own American division, which had a limited launch of the Sega Genesis on August 14th, 1989, in New York and Los Angeles. And the event was a big deal.
$30 million.
It was the exhilaration of having something new. People had never played games on their TV before. They had never gone to an arcade and put a quarter in other than a pinball machine and had something very visual.
As fast as the video game industry hit the marketplace, it was gone. By 1985, sales plummeted to a record low of $100 million. But in 1986, Nintendo used improved technology to lead the resurgence of the home video market. And with Atari and Sega also in the market, sales once again soared, reaching over $1 billion.
They provided a little more color, a little more action. Instead of blocky graphics, they were very high-quality color. And it was arcade titles that people were familiar with, Super Mario Brothers and Space Harrier, things like that they had been playing in the arcades, but now they could play them at home without having to drop a quarter in a slot.
The technology that made home videos possible is called an N-bit system. Now Sega has introduced Genesis, a revolutionary 16-bit system that improves gameplay opportunities, graphics, memory, and sound. This new technology made its nationwide debut in Manhattan with Donald Trump on hand as kids and parents challenged each other to Sega's newest game.
It was a real who's who.
Formula Baseball and Altered Beast.
I love it. I think it's great.
The best I've ever seen. I like it. It's pretty cool.
The 16-bit microprocessor allows for enhanced graphics, more memory capability, stereo sound, depth perception, simulated 3D. You now have a game that is richly enhanced, a game that is very, very similar to that you would find in the arcade.
Night Court's Harry Anderson, an avid video game player, has also tried Sega's
Not just
Genesis.
Donald Trump, but Harry Anderson of Night Court, you
You have a background
guys.
moving one direction, you have a character moving another direction, you have projectiles or objects or the ball in the baseball game moving yet another direction, and the illusion from a magical point of view is remarkable.
Sales of video games show no sign of slowing down as the industry heads into the 90s.
Damn,
And
I
the
know, right?
future?
It's really as far as the imagination can take you. There are a lot of engineers working on pretty exciting products right now. One of those is a room that you could walk into, for example. You'd see an environment. Rather than just a tunnel of a screen, you'd have a whole view around you of an environment, similar to a holodeck in the Star Trek series, which, again, it's very futuristic.
There is so much happening.
That guy
And
talking
basically-
about VR in 1989 and like imagining it like mind-blowing, you know, Star Trek technology is awesome. I love
What
that.
we're
That's how we all
attempting
thought
to
about that
do
stuff back then.
is stay with the state-of-the-art technology.
Anyway, yeah. So that's the release in New York City. Yeah, it was so futuristic back then, right? Like I remember even seeing in malls. You remember those like they'd have like a headset and you'd stand in like a circular thing so you could kind of walk. Those were like mind blowing in like the early 90s. Blew my little mind. Anyway, it's hilarious that Donald Trump was there. Sega was a big deal, and this is not the only celebrity crossovers we're gonna see on Sega. We're going to talk about a few more of those. For the North American market, former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division president and new Sega of America CEO Michael Katz instituted a two-part approach to build sales. So remember, Atari turned down taking over the Sega Corporation. This guy was one of their like top execs, and the actual president of the company said, no, we're not interested in Sega. So this guy, Michael Katz, said, fuck that. I'm leaving, and I'm going to Sega of North America. And he became their CEO. He had a two-part approach to sales, Michael Katz did. And you're going to remember a lot of this. This is what a lot of the video's about, is Sega's sales approach in North America, which is, I just love. There's a ton of nostalgia around their marketing, which is what we're going to look at a lot. So his first thing, since Nintendo owned the console rights to most arcade games at the time, The first part of his strategy involved creating a library of recognizable games. So basically picking up the arcade games that were still available and getting the licenses to put those on consoles. But the most important one is to create a library of games that use the names and likenesses of celebrities and athletes. That was a big Sega strategy early on, and it continued through most of their time putting out games. So we got things like Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf. I didn't put it in here, but there is some hilarious like pixel art portraiture of Arnold Palmer from the game. I should have put it in. It also had Joe Montana Football, which this was a hugely popular game. Joe Montana was just like every little kid who loved football's hero. I remember my older cousin, Ben, played this shit nonstop. I'm not much of a professional sports person, but he loved this. Like, he would not stop playing this at Thanksgiving, to the point where the adults got mad and unplugged the system so they could like watch, real football or whatever it was. He cared about this more than he cared about the actual football games going on. But a big one, which you may or may not remember, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. And since we're talking about Sega music, let's listen to some Moonwalker OST real quick. The craziest thing about this is that they recreated like a bunch of Michael Jackson hits with the Sega FM chip, with the synthesizer chip that came in the console, which is very limited. It can do samples, but they didn't really sample a lot of it. They sampled Michael's voice a little bit, but they mostly recreated all these songs on synth, which is insane. You never played it, Cherish? I didn't either, but my friend Andy played it, and he loved it. It's funny because there's a whole genre of chiptune now where people remake popular music with chiptune sounds. Let's see what else we got. Let's listen to Billie Jean. Like, it's insane that some composer did this. I liked a game called Flashback. Oh, I loved Flashback. The cover of Flashback, where he had like the eye visor, right? The cover art really blew my mind for that game. Listen to that shit. Yeah, I personally prefer this to real Michael Jackson music. Anyway, so yeah, lots of celebrity crossovers. That was their big sales tactic since they could not get a lot of the arcade games, and Nintendo had already snagged those rights. Now that said, they eventually would go on to. So the second part of Michael Katz's marketing strategy for Sega Genesis involved a marketing campaign to challenge Nintendo head on, and also to emphasize their more arcade-like experience available on the Genesis, with slogans including, very famously, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Check it out.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker video game, only on the Genesis system by Sega.
I remember that slogan so well. So do I, Cherish. Yeah, if you were a 90s kid and you paid attention to TV and video games, you were definitely exposed to this. They paid a shitload of money to get this on every TV set in America, essentially. And they hit it hard.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land. A plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. the maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw and said, "This is not good." And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the makers saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
So yeah, that commercial we just watched, that is the first ever Sega Genesis commercial in North America. They call it Sega Genesis commercial number 1. They are obviously hitting at Nintendo without saying Nintendo. They get way more blatant with it in future advertising, but mostly I'm just like, it gives me so much nostalgia. Like, advertising to kids used to be fucking awesome. The production design that used to go into advertising for children was so good and so high, and now it's I think they realize at some point that kids don't need that high of production value to be sold on something. But like, look at this computer this kid's using, this chewed up console, on like a chewed up stone desk. I'm not sure what game they have him playing. And then like video games or just ads, they had a lot more things breaking through stone in ads, toy ads in the 90s and 80s, I believe. I miss that a lot. I miss when things would just burst through concrete like this.
What he saw and said, "This is not good."
All right, I think we have one more commercial here. So we talked about their kind of two-pronged approach of get arcade titles that people know about and use celebrities in games. And then the other one was to go against Nintendo. So that last one showed kind of how they're up against Nintendo. This particular commercial shows them trying to compete with arcades.
Dave Whitney wanted the real arcade games at home, so he got them. Mike Rogers wanted them too. But he got a Genesis system by Sega. Why? Check it out. Arcade screen left, Genesis screen right. If they look the same, you've answered correctly. Besides, Genesis has real-life action in sports games, flying games, and adventure games. The hottest library going. So if you want real arcade action, there's only 2 ways to get it.
Dave, we got your golden axe.
Or get Genesis by Sega. We bring the arcade experience home.
So I think that's an ineffective commercial personally, because they don't talk about how fucking expensive arcade cabinets are. I mean, obviously that's the point, but they just made it look cool. Like, the kid that owned all the arcade cabinets just looks
Dave
cool.
Whitney wanted the real arcade games at home, so he got them. Mike Rogers wanted them too, but he got a Genesis system by Sega.
Mike's setup looks significantly less sweet than the other kids.
Why? Check it out. Arcade.
Anyway, yeah, so they were really trying to compete against arcades. All right, so in mid-1990, Katz, the CEO of Sega America, was replaced as CEO with this guy, Tom Kalinske. Now, Tom Kalinske didn't know anything about video games, but he was a sales and marketing hard ass. This guy came from the school of business hard knocks. He was into something called the razor and blades approach to sales, which is basically you lower the price on the base system, and then you charge more for everything else. You charge more so you charge very little for the razor, but for the additional disposable blades, you charge a lot, and that's where you make your money on peripherals. And so they went with this approach. He developed a 4-point sales plan for Sega North America. That was to cut the price a lot. That's something they would advertise on very hard moving forward, is that they were cheaper than the SNES. He also wanted to, point 2, create an American team to develop games targeted at the American market, which is honestly a very smart strategy. He wanted to expand the aggressive advertising campaigns to hit even harder at Nintendo and to be even more saturated in the market. And then the 4th thing was replace the bundled game that came with Sega. It was originally Altered Beast that came with the Genesis. He replaced it with a new game, Sonic the Hedgehog. This is when the console war truly began. This new strategy that this guy put in, Tom Kalinske, was so much more aggressive. In fact, the Japanese Sega division, most of their board members were against it. But the president of Sega said, you know what? I put you in charge of North America because that's what you know. I'm going to trust your decision on this. And they moved forward with the marketing plan. So, again, they replaced Altered Beast with Sonic, and they basically just started hitting it a lot harder and being a lot more anti-Nintendo. Here's another ad to illustrate.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
Oh, what's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
So there you see pretty much everything from Tom Kalinski's strategy. You see, obviously, the salesman hitting the Nintendo hard, but the kid doesn't care because Sega's cooler. That was basically their whole ad campaign is, Sega's just cool, man. But obviously, look at the price tags at the bottom. $199 versus $149. That's a huge marketing technique they were using at the time. And then just the fact that it was faster and better and that they had Sonic. I mean, honestly, it makes sense, though. Back then, it didn't really matter what the system could do. It more mattered what games do you have, you know? All right, so in large part due to the popularity of Sonic, the Genesis outsold the SNES in the United States nearly 2-1 during the 1991 holiday season, and that's right when Super Nintendo first came out as well. Sega controlled 65% of the 16-bit console market in January 1992, the first time Nintendo had not been the console leader since 1985. The Genesis outsold the SNES for 4 consecutive Christmas seasons due to its 2-year lead, because it did come out 2 years earlier than the SNES. It also had the lower price point, but the big selling point was it had a larger game library compared to the SNES at its release. At this time, Sega had 10 games for every single game on Super Nintendo, which is where this ad comes from. I love this ad. Again, just like marketing back then for kids, the production design was so fucking cool, and I absolutely loved it. Like, I miss promotional photos with this kind of styling. I'll turn off my camera so you can see the whole thing. I'll read the text for you as well. It says, "It's not even close. The massive Sega Genesis library is an insane lineup of more than 150 titles compared to, well, you get the picture. But we're not talking just numbers here. Genesis is going off with unreal new games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Spider-Man, Toe Jam and Earl, Golden Axe 2, and Joe Montana 2 Sports Talk Football. Any one of these would be enough to blister your thumbs for weeks. So for the best selection of arcade games, action adventure, role-playing, sports, you name it, check out the Genesis library. Nothing else stacks up. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more." So their next advertising trick is another famous one, just as famous probably as Sega does what Nintendo don't. Sega's advertising positioned the Genesis as the cooler console, coining a new term, blast processing. An obscure and unused graphics programming method to suggest that its processing capabilities were far greater than those of Super Nintendo. A Sony focus group at the time found that teenage boys would not admit to owning a Super Nintendo rather than a Genesis. That's how much these advertising marketing schemes permeated the zeitgeist of American kids at the time. It was way more uncool to own a Super Nintendo, which is funny because that would flip-flop later. Because I remember in the late 90s, I was like, fuck, I wish I had a Super Nintendo. Right before the N64 came out, I was jealous that my neighbor had a Super Nintendo. But anyway, yeah, let's talk about blast processing. Blast processing. Were you the weird kid with the non-popular console? Absolutely, man. No, I was just a Sega kid. I wouldn't say that was weird. At this time, having a Sega was actually super fucking cool, as this focus group points out. But I always preferred the SNES. I love both, but I have a weird nostalgia thing with the SNES because it's the one I never had. I'm obsessed with it as an adult because I did not have it as a kid, if that makes sense. It was something I would play at my friends' houses. And the games library for the SNES grew a lot, and it included a lot of popular titles. So anyway, blast processing led to such advertisements like this one.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? What if you don't have blast processing?
They're shitting on Nintendo so hard with this ad. It's absolutely hilarious. Like the fucking race car and then the little buggy with the Super Nintendo on it. Honestly, the production design of this, even the buggy with the Super Nintendo on it, it's obviously not a race car, but it's such a cool car. It's like an old milk truck. Look at it. It's actually a really cool vehicle, but to a 9-year-old boy, you know, obviously the race car was what they were looking for. Sega! So Nintendo and Sega focused heavily on impression management of the market, even going to the point of deception. Nintendo, I love this corporate espionage shit, by the way. It's my favorite. Fun fact, it's illegal in Argentina to make an ad and mention your competition or shitting on them in any way. Yeah, it's illegal in a lot of countries, but this is their North American campaign specifically. They went so hard, and it's hilarious. Some people even claim that, like, near the end, Sega, like, the marketing was desperate and, like, thirsty, which I get that. Like, it's so edgelordy, you know? But, so, Nintendo was hit so hard by this in North America, and the impression management of the market was so important to both companies, Nintendo lied, claiming it had sold more consoles in 1991 than it actually had, and forecasted it would sell 6 million consoles by the end of 1992, while its actual US install base at the end of 1992 was only just more than 4 million units, which is still huge, but like that's essentially fraud. It's like lying to your investors, right? Anyway, so due to these tactics, it was difficult to ascertain a clear leader in the market share for several years at a time. With Nintendo's dollar share of the US 16-bit market dipping down from 60% at the end of 1992 down to 37% at the end of 1993, they were essentially getting their ass kicked in the console war at first in the United States. Sega claiming 55% of all 16-bit hardware sales during 1994. Now that would change, as we all know. Sega's not even around making hardware anymore. The big turning point? Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country helped the SNES bounce back to outsell the Genesis from 1995 through 1997. And so there was some mixed data on this for a while. According to a study in 2004 of NPD sales data, the Genesis maintained its lead over the SNES in the American 16-bit console market the whole time. It turns out that's not true. Going back now, a newer 2014 Wedbush Securities report, based on the revised NPD sales data, shows that the SNES outsold the Sega Genesis in the United States by about 1.5 million units. And this is what I was talking about, this era, 1995 through 97. This is when I went from thinking it was awesome that I had a Genesis to being super jealous that my neighbors all had Super Nintendo. My next door neighbor kid had all the Mario games. He had Mario RPG. He had Final Fantasy, the stuff that I was super jealous of and wished I could play. I was also an RPG kid, and Sega had Phantasy Star and a couple good RPG titles, but SNES and Nintendo in general, obviously with Square Enix, had so much better choices in role-playing games at the time, and I was super jealous of that. I mostly just wanted to play all the role-playing games that my neighbor had. And like Mario Kart and Mario and some other things, you know, that were Nintendo exclusive. Donkey Kong Country was definitely one I would spend the night at my friend's house, not because I really liked the friends so much, but because I liked playing Donkey Kong Country, and he owned it. I mean, they did stop making consoles, so something went wrong, yeah. Something that starts with an S and ends with Oni PlayStation, yeah, exactly. Dreamcast was great, but they dropped the ball with the ability to copy the games. That was the end of Sega consoles, yeah. Dreamcast had a lot of great capabilities, but it was so bungled, it's unfortunate. All right, so that's the brief history of the Sega Genesis Super Nintendo console war. Now we're gonna move into the music making portion. We're gonna talk about making music for the Sega Genesis. We're gonna start off with this hilarious interview. I'm not gonna even give it any introduction. It's so fucking 90s, and as a film editor, this shit drives me up the wall. The editing is insane. This is from a much longer video. We're just gonna watch this little portion. So high tech.
Hi, my name is Howard. I'm a music director for Sega Technical Institute, and I do all the musics and sound effects. Where are you going? Hi, my name is Howard. I'm music director for Sega Technical Institute.
What is all this rewinding and redoing? It's terrible editing. Terrible. Okay, we're gonna watch the rest of this, but this comes from this video. If you ever are bored and want to watch some nostalgia stuff and you're interested in Sega, the whole video is on YouTube. It's called like New Opportunities in the Workplace at Sega. They tour the entire Sega America division. They talk to animators, game designers. They talk to the CEO a bunch. They show what their offices look like. It's so fucking funny and interesting also. So this guy actually did write soundtracks. He was the guy who just got all the music prepped for games in North America. He also did some soundtracks. He did Comic Zone, which is a very famous soundtrack.
Hi, my name is Howard Drawson. I'm a music director for Sega Technical Institute, and I have all this great equipment here, which was paid for by Sega, of course.
Must be nice.
This is my board. All of these sound modules you see in front of you are all run through this board, and then I get mixing levels on each of them, and that's how I put the music together. For Genesis development, I use this computer, and I'm able to manipulate the sounds here in the Genesis. That little crazy looking thing sticking out of it is a music development card, which makes it possible for me to do what I have to do. And I make the voices, flutes, drums, whatever, and I sequence them on the computer. And then it gets downloaded into the game, and then we have music and sound effects in the game. So some people think I'm a mad scientist, and, well, I am. First, the team that's doing the game will come to me with the game, and we'll take a look at it and spec it out and so forth and discuss what sounds are going to go where, what style of music, and usually they have a pretty good idea about what style, but I'll always offer my opinions. And then I'll usually begin with the music first, and I make the sounds, once again, in the Genesis over there with that development system. And I'll usually start out maybe with a drum beat. I'll make some sounds and I'll take some drums like these, sampled drums. So I can actually play them into the computer and sequence them in such a way, you know, like, or anything I want, and I can create this loop and these and kind of a drum sound going on. Then I'll take, say, well, this isn't a great example, but we have a clarinet, and I can play some chords over the top of it and actually make my music, make a melody or something.
You're so happy that music exists. What, Comic Zone specific, Stanley, or just Sega music?
As far as sound effects go, a lot of the sound effects are digitized, meaning that we actually digitally record them much in the same way that that drum you heard was. And
oh, just music in general. Yeah, me too, man. I love music. It's crazy how much my taste has changed over time, but I do love music. I love video game music especially. So what he's talking about right now, sampling, is a big advantage that Sega had at first over like Nintendo, you know, entertainment system. Now, Super Nintendo used 100% sampled sounds. It had a very unique way of making music, which is why the music is really unique. But Sega, that's how they had all those crunchy ass voice samples, like someone going Sega. Or if you played Earthworm Jim, they use an insane amount of samples in that. Oh yeah, I loved Earthworm Jim. Me too. Do you remember the intro music where it was all just like ooh ah ooh 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 ah? That was all like samples played back on a keyboard, which is crazy. Is this it? I mean, him burping Earthworm Jim is a great sample, but that's not the song I'm thinking of. And it's such great use of the hardware to do something really, really unique. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to find it quickly, but we can look at it later. We'll do a whole day where we try and do an Earthworm Jim inspired song, hopefully, on one of these episodes. I spent too long making Beavis and Butthead laugh at the start of the game. Yeah, absolutely. Beavis and Butthead also used samples in a really great way, truly. All right, so let's move on. We're not going to get too deep into how making the music works. Instead, we're just going to make the music, but we'll talk briefly about what that guy, Howard Jocelyn, was doing right there. So when Sega Genesis first came out, the hardware was not documented well, and it was incredibly hard to make music for the system and to alter the synthesizer that was built into it at all. So basically, all the music sounded really samey, and it wasn't that great because it was mostly written by programmers who understood how to make it. Like your average musician who didn't have a deep understanding of programming couldn't easily make Sega Genesis music. Eventually, I think like 91, I don't know, this says 94, so maybe that's when it came out. Sega invented new software to create music that was easier for musicians to use without having to know a lot of programming. It was called GEMS, and this is what it looked like. It came with something like 100 plus 105, 106 pre-made instruments that could create different sounds. You see some of them here. So sound number 47 was just called harp. Sound number 51 was called FM shimmer, frequency modulated shimmer. And that's why a lot of Sega games have the exact same tonal palette. Games that were made quickly and just shoved through production, the producers and the composers would just use these pre-made sounds basically to slap together a soundtrack for a game quickly. And then that means they were all using the same 106 sounds, which is a lot, but I mean, a lot of them are just like a drum sound or something like that, you know? So you end up hearing a very similar tonal palette in a lot of Sega games, but this GEM software was capable of using the synthesizer inside to create your own sounds. But FM synthesis is really tough to master and to create nice sounds with. The specific kind of synthesizer that the Sega had, we'll talk about in a second. But also to use this GEM software, you had to have some pretty crazy hardware, which we're going to look at real fast. He mentioned it in the video, this thing on the left here. He called it a development board. It's basically just a very fancy early 90s version of a flash cart. Like you could flash things to these little chips, and then you could plug them into these slots to basically play things through a Sega. And then there was a second piece called a connector board, just kind of behind my webcam here. You can use that connector board in kind of, you know, with that flash cart, that ROM board or development cartridge, whatever they called it. And then you would be able to actually plug in MIDI data into a computer. I really love the picture on the right. I think it's a more modern picture, I'm not sure. But I love it because whoever is making this music is obviously sleeping on a fold-out couch bed. And they also have their entire Sega emulation ROM board, connector board, and music making setup for GEMS set up on a fold-out bed for some reason with like a bunch of dirty laundry on the floor. It's just like gamer life encapsulated, and I really like that. So yeah, you can still actually get the GEMS software and run it on like DOS emulators. It was a DOS-only program. It was really RAM intensive, so at the time you could not run it in Windows because Windows took too much RAM. You just ran it in DOS. But that's not the preferred way of making Sega music now. So let's talk about how people make Sega music nowadays. This is what I wanted to do. When I decided we were going to start making Sega music on stream, I was going to do what I've been doing with the Game Boy, or what I'm about to start doing with the Game Boy, which is you can get a program someone designed for Game Boy. We'll be doing this soon, by the way. You put a little cartridge in with this program, and it allows you to play the sound chip in the Game Boy like a synthesizer, and you could just use the sound output to record that. So you could actually basically use a console as a synthesizer. You play it with a MIDI controller. This allows you to send a MIDI signal into the console, use the sound chip, play it, and then get sound out. So Sega had the same kind of thing called Gen MDM. They're both made by the same company, Cat Skull Electronics. You see the little cat head on the chip here. This little chip actually plugged into the controller port of the Sega, and that's how you sent MIDI into it, was through the controller port, which is really genius. This company, Cat Skull, does not exist anymore. They don't make these anymore. These Gen MDM cartridges and this little chip, the Gen MDM controller MIDI port, you can get them used on like Reverb.com. They go for like $200 to $400. They are not cheap. And I'm trying to keep things somewhat cheap We'll invest a little more money in Sega Music later, but we don't need all this for us to make Sega Music. We'll talk about how we're going to do it in a second. So Gen MDM, that was my first instinct because it's the same thing I'm doing with the Game Boy with MGB, which is MIDI Game Boy. But we're not going to do that. There are some very expensive plugins for your DAW or digital audio workspace. So if you use Pro Tools, Logic Pro, the recording program you use essentially, you can buy third-party plugins that will work right inside the program that basically allow you to do different software instruments. This one by Plogue, Chip Synth, not Chimp Synth, is super popular. The MD stands for Mega Drive, and it specifically recreates Sega music, like very closely, very well. They have a really cool Super Nintendo one. When we eventually get to Super Nintendo on this show, I might look at the Plogue version, their plugin for Super Nintendo. There's a few different Super Nintendo plugins out there that are really cool, and I would like to have them. But again, these are very expensive. I think they are also around $200, or like 150 to 200 bucks. Don't quote me on that, but I did look at the price and I was like, not right now, not worth it right now. This is what I would really like. These are expensive hardware synths that have the exact same sound chip as the Sega. I think this one goes for $250. It's one of the cheaper ones, the Sonic Mega Synthesis. There's a bunch of companies making synths like this that specifically just recreate Sega sound. Sega sound is so beloved. Sega Genesis sound is so beloved. There's a lot of companies that make this kind of thing. The one I will eventually go for when we go for a hardware version will be this right here. The Caster synth. I think this is also around $250. You plug a MIDI controller into the back and you can play it. But you can adjust all the synthesizer stuff with just these two knobs. And if you look in the middle, it's showing off a Yamaha YM3438 chip. We're going to talk a little bit about chips. I don't want to get too technical today. I want to drive you guys away with too much tech talk, but these things are awesome, these Caster synths. Again, I'm not advertised by any of these companies. I'm just into making chiptune music. Then there's this fucking guy. Look Mum No Computer. We're not gonna watch this whole video, but this dude, you see that monstrosity he has? He built that with an original Sega. If I was way more electronic savvy, I would do the same thing, but this guy knows his shit. I highly recommend watching his YouTube channel. He makes synthesizers, but it's not overly technical. It's more just crazy and fun, and the music he makes is awesome. His workshop is nuts. If you look behind, you can see his Game Boy synthesizer with 50 Game Boys on it. But anyway, watch this.
So if you've seen any of my past videos, you'll probably know that I have a soft spot for making music with products that are old crap, and most notably old games consoles.
Another thing about this dude, looks like something Tangerine Dream used in the 80s. Yeah, for real. The way it looks reminds me of a Moog. Definitely Cherish. This guy knows everything about synths, and he's definitely trying to make them look like classic synthesizers like Moogs and stuff in some way. He's famous for making a synth out of 60 Furbies. He has a wall of Furbies, and he can play them with a keyboard, and their mouths open, each different Furby's a different note. So when he plays the notes, their mouths open and they sing like a little chorus. It's fucking insane. Anyway, let's skip ahead.
The pointless venture of actually trying to do it with the real thing. I'm using a custom cartridge made by Little Scale, who's a genius, who's also made the Master System one, and you can purchase this at Catskill Electronics.
See, that's the thing I was talking about, but those aren't around anymore. Here we go. Look at this thing.
Here it is. The Sega Mega Drive, but with lots of knobs. It also makes a fabulous fashion accessory.
I love that it's got a handle.
Complete yet, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
So he plays it at the end.
We'll talk about that later.
Let's skip forward. So badass.
Right, what am I going to adjust?
Just look at this dude's studio. It's so cool. Just walls of modular synths. The Game Boy synth is behind the Sega synth there. Anyway, everything that Look Mum No Computer does is awesome. I highly recommend checking out that YouTube channel. It's one of my favorite channels for sure. He does some cool Moog stuff. He does a lot of video game stuff. He does live performances, all kinds of stuff. He's really cool. All of those things I just showed you are different ways of making Sega Genesis music. Using the same limitations as the hardware, but we're not doing any of those ways. We may eventually do a hardware synthesizer, like I mentioned. So I'll show you how we're going to do it. But first, let's talk about how Segas make sound. Sega Genesis has 2 chips in it. It has the Yamaha YM2612, a very famous synthesizer chip. This chip is basically a synthesizer when you put it together with all the circuitry. And then it has a Texas Instruments SN76489. Yeah, that's right. Texas Instruments, the same company that made those crazy expensive graphing calculators that you had to have if you took calculus in high school or college. Anyway, yeah, so these 2 sound chips, we're mostly going to talk about the YM2612. The Texas Instruments chip could make sound, but was less often used in the music making portion of the Genesis. Sometimes it was, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It basically, the TI SN76489, it basically had the same capabilities as like, pretty close to like what a Nintendo Entertainment System or a Game Boy could do. It had 4 synth voices. One of them was just a noise channel. The other 3 were like 2 square channels, 2 square waves, and then maybe a triangle wave. I'm not sure about that, but it was much more basic. It basically can make the sounds a Nintendo Entertainment System could make. Not a Super, but the original NES. But the Yamaha YM2612 is what is known as an FM synthesizer chip. FM meaning frequency modulation. We'll talk about that in a second too. The tech specs for the YM2612, it had the following capabilities. It had 6 channels of FM synthesizers. So you could have up to 6 different synthesizers playing at one time. The synthesizers can only play 1 note each at a time though. They don't have polyphony. You can't play chords. You only play 1 note at a time. So it had 6 channels. It had an 8-bit digitized audio channel as a replacement for one of the FM channels. So you could do 5 FM synth channels and 1 digitized audio channel. What that means is an 8-bit sample. So you could take an audio recording and digitize it at a very low sample rate, 8 bits, which sounds like, you know, a Nintendo, essentially, an 8-bit system. So that's why when you hear like Earthworm Jim's voice or Beavis and Butthead laugh or things like that, it's so crunchy sounding because it's downsampled a bunch to basically be able to fit in the game cartridge on the storage included, and also just to be able to play on the channel provided. So it also had 1 low frequency oscillator to distort the FM sound, so you could do like sweeps and like a fake delay kind of thing. And it had some other capabilities as well, but those are the main ones we're going to stick to. 6 channels of FM sound. Each channel has 4 operators, they call it. We'll talk about that later. That's more technical stuff. And then 1 channel of samples. So real quick, let's talk about FM synths versus subtractive synths. And this is as technical as we're going to get today, and it's really not a technical breakdown of what these 2 things can do. It's a very distinctive type of sound that is at once realistic and believable, but also somehow unnatural and artificial sounding. So yeah, a lot of times what they're doing on an an FM synth is trying to recreate like a flute sound, or an oboe, or a drum sound, or a bass guitar, like a distorted bass. Like they really are trying to emulate the sound of a real instrument, and that's why they were really popular in the 80s. Now, what you all probably think of when you think of synthesizers is what we call subtractive synthesis. And Cherish, you mentioned the Moog earlier. That's a mini Moog on the right. And that's a subtractive synth. Subtractive synthesis is the sound that most people think of when they think synthesizer. It's not where you go for a realistic orchestral simulation or guitar sound. It's where you go when you want to sound like a synthesizer, and especially where you go when you want the ability to twist a knob or move a fader to change the sound in real time. So when you hear like electronic music or EDM or dubstep, and like you hear sweeping noises and undulating, like that's all subtractive synthesis. That's what that is. So real quick, let's look at a couple examples. Here's your FM synth sound. Things to really pay attention to here. The main like bam 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 bam. That's kind of an organ sound, but listen to the bass guitar in Sonic music. It sounds like a bass guitar. Okay, so here's an example of subtractive synthesis. This is from, not from a video game, but from one of my favorite albums ever, Mother Earth's Plantasia by Mort Garson. So you hear all that sweeping and filtering? It's very subtractive. Right here. Definitely check out Plantasia. I just played like the 4th song. The first song on the album is such a banger. Mort Garson was a weird synth composer from the 70s and 80s. He's still around, I believe, but this particular album is a banger front to back. It's amazing chill music. He basically wrote an entire synth album for plants to enjoy. We play it to our house plants sometimes. Highly recommend Plantasia. Super good. This is how we are going to make the music, kind of. This is how we're going to make Sega music. We're going to talk real quick about the Yamaha DX7. So remember, we talked about that Yamaha chip, that FM synthesis chip that the Sega had. The Yamaha DX7 is a synthesizer manufactured by Yamaha Corporation from 1983 to 1989. It was the first successful digital synthesizer and is one of the best-selling synthesizers in history, selling more than 200,000 units. With its complex menus and lack of conventional controls, few learned to program it in depth. However, its preset sounds became staples of 1980s pop music. In 1986, the Yamaha DX7 was used on 40% of the #1 singles on the US Billboard Hot 100, which is hilarious to me, which is why all that, like, Tears for Fears, Brian Eno, all that stuff, like, they all sound so fucking similar. They're all using presets. Now, I shouldn't say that, because Brian Eno was very good at FM synthesis, and he was one of the few people that was making his own sounds. He really had an in-depth understanding of how these things work. But it says here, its electric piano sound was particularly widely used, especially in power ballads. So that really lame synth piano sound that, like, a lot of 80s power ballad stuff has, that's all the same synthesizer. The other 60% of songs on Top 100 were probably all using the Casio stock sounds, because Casio also, the very famous stock sound library, a very famous synthesized piano tone. Anyway, so chips based on the DX sound chip, such as the YM2612, were used in technologies like the Sega Genesis game consoles. So the FM synth chip in the Sega was directly based on the chip from the Yamaha DX7. They are not exactly the same, but they have almost identical capabilities and sounds. So that's how we're going to make it. Now, I don't own a DX7. They're expensive. They don't make them anymore. They're collector's items. But there's this company, Arturia. And Arturia, that's who my synth controller is made by, my MIDI controller. You can see it right here over my shoulder lighting up all crazy. It comes with a bunch of stock sounds, but I went also, they had a sale last week. It might still be going on. It's like 50% off everything on their store. I bought a plugin for my DAW Logic Pro called the Arturia DX7.5, and it is straight up the DX7 in software form. It's a software instrument, but it makes all the same sounds. It has 6 operators, which is exactly what the Sega had. Each operator has 4 voices or 4 operators in it. And yeah, I don't know much about FM synthesis or how to use it. We're going to learn how together, and we're going to make some Sega inspired music. Now, an even cooler thing, someone took the sound fonts and put them into files from every single Sega game that are compatible with this thing. So I can upload if I'm not good at making my own sounds, or I'm still learning on that, I can upload every musical sound from every Sega game directly to this thing. And so if we want to make a Sonic inspired game, we just grab all the Sonic sounds and upload it as patches, and then I can use those directly on the synthesizer. That's what I'm going to be using. All right, real quick, my little presentation here. My sources were mostly the Sega Genesis Wikipedia page, but also this dude GST channel. If you're interested in video game music and the history of it, this dude has some awesome stuff. I pulled a ton of stuff from him. I learned a lot from him about Sega and its music capabilities. He doesn't just do Sega, though. He does, like, Super Nintendo and other things. So, yeah, those are my sources for my little presentation. And that's it. We've covered the history of Sega Genesis music, and now we can maybe look at making some Sega music. I don't know if we're gonna finish a full song. I gotta be done at 7:30. I usually give myself a 2-hour time limit, as you guys know if you've been on these streams before. So we're not gonna go with the time limit. The time limit is just gonna be when I have to end the stream and go to dinner, but I'm gonna go over there and we're gonna fuck around with some DX7 sounds and see what kind of music we can make. We'll try and upload some of those sonic noises and other things and play with them. And I'll show you guys what the Arturia DX7 plugin looks like. It's really cool. We'll try and make something Sega-ish today, but we may not finish by the time it's time to end the stream. But this is just an introduction. Probably the next 2 or 3 weeks, I will be doing Sega music every Tuesday with our normal 2-hour time limit. I have all this Game Boy mod stuff to play the Game Boy like a synthesizer using MGB. We're going to do that too, but I might do that on different days. I may not do that as my Tuesday stream because I actually have to physically mod the Game Boy, which I'll probably do on stream. We'll take it apart. We'll look at all the parts together. It's going to be super fucking nerdy. It's going to be awesome. If you're into that, keep an eye out. I don't know exactly what day, but yeah.